She was last seen alive on the night of April 4th, 2025. By Easter morning, her husband was standing at a boatyard in Marsh Harbor, calm, unhurried, checking his watch, while somewhere out in the dark waters of the Sea of Abaco, Lynette Hooker had vanished, not panicked, not screaming her name into the water, not doing anything that a man who had just lost his wife overboard in the middle of the night would do. He was wandering in the shadows, looking behind things, calm, eerie, and holding something in his left hand that would disappear before anyone could ask what it was. That moment, caught on surveillance cameras at the boatyard, is the image that investigators could not ignore, because it didn't just contradict Brian Hooker's story. It contradicted every instinct a human being would have if the person they loved most had just been swallowed by the ocean. And now, weeks later, the United States Coast Guard is returning to the Bahamas with dive teams, with a remotely operated underwater vehicle, with a cadaver dog trained to detect decomposition through 30 feet of water, with investigators from the Coast Guard Investigative Service who have formally reclassified this case. This is no longer a missing persons investigation. This is a suspected murder. This is the crime files. No sensationalism, no exploitation, just evidence, just analysis, just the pursuit of truth. Lynette Hooker was a woman who loved the sea, or at least she loved someone who did. She had left the land behind to live aboard a sailboat called Soulmate with her husband, Brian Hooker, navigating the waters of the Bahamas as part of a lifestyle that looked, from the outside, like freedom. Blue water, warm sun, a married couple sailing into the horizon together. But the life aboard Soulmate was not what it appeared to be. And by the time Lynette bought a plane ticket home to Michigan in March of 2025, something had shifted in her. A decision, perhaps a final one, had been made. That ticket was dated March 11th. 2 weeks later, she would be dead. Or at least, that is what investigators now believe. Before we go any further, let us establish what we know from documented records, witness accounts, and official sources. This script will not speculate beyond what the evidence supports. Every claim here has a foundation in verified reporting, public records, or statements made by law enforcement and named witnesses. Lynette Hooker was a citizen of the United States. She and Brian Hooker were living aboard Soulmate, a sailboat registered in Florida, meaning it flew a United States flag and fell under United States federal jurisdiction. That detail will become critically important as this case unfolds. The Sea of Abaco, where all of this took place, is Bahamian territory. But under both United States maritime law and long-standing international precedent, when a person dies or is believed to have been killed aboard a United States flagged vessel, the United States Coast Guard has jurisdiction, regardless of what waters that vessel is sailing through. This is not a loophole. It is the law, and it is the legal foundation upon which this entire investigation rests. Now let us go back to the night of April 4th, 2025, and let us walk through it minute by minute, detail by detail, the way investigators do, not the way a husband in grief would tell it, the way the facts tell it. According to available reporting, the last confirmed public sighting of Brian Hooker before the incident occurred at approximately 7 hours in the evening on April 4th, at a location called the Abaco, a gathering spot in the Abaco area. He was seen wearing a particular hat, described as cowboy-styled, that would appear again in surveillance footage hours later. This places him at a specific location, in specific clothing, at a specific time. That is the beginning of the timeline. What happens in the hours between 7 o'clock in the evening and 3:35 in the morning is at the center of this investigation, still being reconstructed. Brian Hooker has provided a version of those hours. Investigators have provided another. And the GPS data from Soulmate and its dinghy, we are told, supports the investigators, not the husband. According to Hooker's account, at some point during the night, while he and Lynette were out in the small dinghy attached to Soulmate, a small motor-powered inflatable used to ferry between the anchored sailboat and shore, Lynette fell overboard. He said the dinghy bounced, and she went into the water. He said he was unable to recover her. He said the motor failed. He said he drifted. He said the wind and the waves eventually carried him to the eastern shore of Marsh Harbor, where he arrived in the early morning hours of April 5th, Easter Sunday. That is his story. Those are his words. And virtually every verifiable piece of evidence that has emerged since then calls that story into serious question. Let us start with the GPS data. Investigators have analyzed the GPS records associated with Soulmate and its dinghy. What those records show, according to sources familiar with the investigation, is movement that is inconsistent with a vessel being carried passively by wind and current. When a boat loses propulsion, when the motor dies and the operator is at the mercy of the sea, it moves the way the sea moves it. It follows the wind, it follows the current. It ends up where the physics of the ocean take it. But if a vessel's GPS track shows deliberate navigation, if it shows a pattern of movement that requires active steering, conscious decision-making, controlled speed, then the motor was not dead. Then the operator was not helpless. Then the story about drifting through the night falls apart. That is precisely what the GPS data appears to show in this case. Brian Hooker was not drifting. He was driving. Where he drove to and what he did during those hours is what investigators are now trying to determine. And it is why the Coast Guard cutter Margaret Norville, 154-foot fast response cutter with a crew of approximately 24 people, capable of speeds up to 35 knots, is returning to the Bahamas with divers, an ROV, and a cadaver dog. The ROV, a remotely operated underwater vehicle, functions as a camera beneath the surface. It can descend into depths where a diver cannot safely operate and transmit real-time video footage back to investigators on the surface. In cases involving suspected underwater disposal of evidence, the ROV is one of the most critical tools available. It was used extensively in the search for Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. It is now being deployed in the search for Lynette Hooker. The cadaver dog is named Maggie. She is a canine trained by the Broward County Sheriff's Office in Florida and has been on loan to the Coast Guard during this investigation. Maggie is not an ordinary search dog. She has been trained specifically to detect the chemical signatures of human decomposition, and according to her handler, Maggie is capable of detecting those signatures through as much as 30 feet of water. This sounds almost impossible, but the science supports it. When a human body decomposes underwater, it releases oils and gases that rise toward the surface. As those compounds dissipate upward through the water column, a sufficiently sensitive cadaver dog positioned on a boat above can detect the scent at the waterline. The ocean does not hide everything, not from a nose trained to find what it is looking for. Maggie searched multiple locations in the early weeks of this investigation. She searched the land, she searched from the water, she searched Soulmate itself. But there is one thing she has not yet searched: the dinghy. The small inflatable boat at the center of Brian Hooker's account of that night has been in the custody of the Royal Bahamian Police Force, held in an impound lot, exposed to the elements. Maggie will now search it, pending Bahamian authorization, which investigators expect will be granted. There is, however, a complication. The dinghy has been sitting outside for more than 7 weeks. There have been rains. There has been exposure. If there were once decomposition compounds present on or in that dinghy, if there was once biological evidence that could have guided Maggie to an alert, some of that evidence may have been washed away. This is not a certainty. It is a variable, and it is one of the many reasons why timing matters in criminal investigations. Evidence does not wait. Now let us talk about the morning of April 5th, because what Brian Hooker did, and how he behaved, when he arrived at that boatyard in Marsh Harbor is, in the judgment of sources familiar with the investigation, one of the most telling pieces of the entire case. According to reporting by the Daily Mail, which obtained and reviewed surveillance video from the boatyard, Brian Hooker appeared at approximately 3:35 in the morning on Easter Sunday. He was wearing a blue shirt, dark shorts, and what the Daily Mail described as flip-flops. Those sources with direct knowledge of the rescue operation say they were slides, not flip-flops. He was wearing the cowboy-styled hat that had been noted in his earlier appearance at the Abaquico, and he was carrying a yellow dry bag. He did not shout. He did not run. He did not appear to be in any state of distress. He was not calling out his wife's name. He was not raising the alarm about a woman lost at sea. He was wandering, casually, looking behind things, moving in and out of shadows, apparently unaware that security cameras were capturing his behavior in detail. He checked his watch. Not once, multiple times. Sources who have reviewed the footage describe his behavior, in their words, as eerie. A man who, by his own account, had just spent 8 or 9 hours adrift in the ocean after watching his wife fall overboard, who had no propulsion, no way to call for help, no way to control where he ended up. That man arrived at a boatyard in the small hours of Easter morning and wandered around nonchalantly, looking behind buildings, not seeking help from the lit structures in the vicinity, not shouting, not crying, not doing anything that a person in genuine distress would do. There are multiple surveillance cameras at that boatyard, multiple angles, multiple recordings. The Daily Mail reviewed at least one of them. Investigators have reviewed all of them. When the Hopetown Volunteer Fire and Rescue Team arrived to bring Brian Hooker from the boatyard onto their vessel, 4 rescuers were present. All 4 would later be interviewed about what they observed that morning. Their accounts of his demeanor align with the surveillance footage. Calm, collected, not appearing to be a man who had just survived a maritime disaster and lost his wife to the sea. What they do not all agree on is the color of the bag he was carrying. One rescuer remembered a yellow bag. Another remembered aqua blue. A third recalled royal blue. A fourth did not remember any particular color. This divergence in memory is not unusual in eyewitness testimony and does not, by itself, suggest anything sinister. But the yellow dry bag is notable because it appears clearly in the surveillance footage. What is also notable, according to sources with knowledge of the footage, is that Brian Hooker appeared to be holding something else, a dark, tablet-like object in his left hand. That object is not visible in subsequent footage or photographs. It is not something that appears in the inventory of items Brian Hooker had with him when the rescue team brought him aboard. Where it went, whether it was placed in the yellow dry bag, whether it was discarded, whether it was something entirely mundane, is unknown. But investigators have noted it. Now we must address something that the evidence alone cannot fully explain, but that provides essential context for understanding why investigators reached the conclusions they have reached. This is not simply a case of a man telling an improbable story about a maritime accident. This is a case in which the man at the center of that story has a documented history, a history known to Lynette's family, known to her friends, known to at least some investigators, of violence against the woman who is now dead. Lynette Hooker reportedly told her mother on multiple occasions that Brian had choked her to the point of unconsciousness. She showed a friend photographs of bruises on her back, explaining that she had been pressed against the hull of the sailboat while he choked her. She left Soulmate more than once and told her mother she was leaving Brian for good. Her mother, desperate, even consulted resources at battered women's shelters, trying to find better ways to persuade her daughter not to return. And each time, Lynette went back. This is a pattern that is well documented in the research on domestic violence. It is not a reflection of weakness on Lynette's part. It is a reflection of the profound psychological complexity of intimate partner violence, of the cycles of coercion and control that make leaving extraordinarily dangerous and psychologically difficult. We do not present this information to judge Lynette. We present it because it is relevant to understanding what may have happened aboard Soulmate on the night of April 4th. There is also a prior legal matter. Brian Hooker was charged in connection with an incident involving his then 12-year-old daughter, who alleged that he had choked her. The case went to trial. Multiple witnesses testified. His defense argued that the memories were implanted, a strategy that has been used in other cases involving child witnesses, though typically involving much younger children. A jury acquitted him. That acquittal is a legal fact. It does not erase the testimony that was given. It does not make the allegation disappear. It simply means that a jury, applying the criminal standard of beyond reasonable doubt, did not find the evidence sufficient for conviction. That child, according to available reporting, never had contact with Brian Hooker again. Lynette's mother has spoken publicly. Lynette's daughter, Carly Ellsworth, is living through this. Every development in this investigation lands on a family that is already carrying an unbearable weight. We note this not for emotional effect, but because it is true, and because the truth of who Lynette was and who loved her is inseparable from the truth of what happened to her. Now, Lynette had purchased a plane ticket. The date on that ticket was March 11th, 2025. She was planning to leave the Bahamas. She was planning to go home. 2 weeks after that ticket was purchased, she was gone. Not home, not anywhere that anyone has been able to find. What happened in those 2 weeks? What conversations took place aboard Soulmate? What did Brian Hooker know about that ticket? What did he say when he found out? These are questions that investigators are working to answer. They are questions that may ultimately be answered in a courtroom if the evidence gathered in the coming weeks supports the filing of charges. Brian Hooker has not been charged with any crime as of the time this script was written. He is the subject of a suspected murder investigation. He has retained legal counsel, notably a new attorney with a background in federal litigation, a former Department of Justice lawyer. This choice of counsel is significant. Federal cases prosecuted under maritime law and Coast Guard jurisdiction, require a different kind of defense than state-level criminal matters. Brian Hooker, or those advising him, apparently understands that the legal battle coming may be a federal one. Let us now turn to the geography of what investigators believe happened and where the search is being focused. Soulmate was anchored in a specific location in the waters near Abaco on the night of April 4th. According to sources familiar with the investigation, Soulmate did not move that night. The larger vessel stayed where it was. What moved was the dinghy, and the dinghy's GPS track, which shows movement inconsistent with passive drifting, suggests that Brian Hooker was navigating it deliberately in the hours between Lynette's disappearance and his arrival at the boatyard. The question is, where did he go and why? There are physical constraints on the answer to that question. The dinghy was a small, 8-foot inflatable with an electric motor. Electric motors have limited battery life. At high speed, the battery drains faster. At slow speed, as slow as 1 mile per hour, the battery lasts longer. But even at the most conservative estimate, The dinghy had a finite range. It could not have traveled far from the anchor point of Soulmate. It could not have gone out into the open Atlantic, not with an 8-foot inflatable in conditions that included winds reported at 18 to 20 knots. That physical constraint actually helps investigators narrow the search area. Lynette, if she was placed in the water or on land, is likely within a relatively defined radius of where Soulmate was anchored that night. The eastern shore of Marsh Harbor, particularly the areas south of the location where Hooker claims he washed ashore, is a focus of the search. There are locations in that area, investigators believe, that are accessible by a small dinghy, that are sufficiently isolated to have offered cover of darkness, and that are deep enough to conceal what investigators suspect may have been put there. One area of particular interest is near the Tilloo Cut, a passage that connects the protected waters of the Sea of Abaco to the open Atlantic. In the immediate vicinity of the cut, in areas that remain within the protected water, there are depths of up to 40 feet. That is deep enough that a body weighted and submerged there would not be visible from the surface. It is also within the range of the dinghy's battery capacity. Lynette had, according to sources, a pink weight belt, a piece of diving equipment used to offset a diver's buoyancy. That pink weight belt has not been found. It was not aboard Soulmate when investigators processed the vessel. Its absence is noted. Its significance, if any, is something that investigators are actively considering. Soulmate itself has been seized. The vessel was processed as a crime scene, its contents were inventoried, and shortly, according to sources, it will be hauled out of the water entirely and placed in dry dock, where it can be subjected to the kind of detailed forensic examination that is not possible when a boat is floating. Every surface, every compartment, every piece of equipment, every trace that the sea has not yet washed away. This is how maritime homicide investigations work. They are slower than land-based investigations. The ocean erodes evidence. Time is always working against the investigator. But the tools available to the Coast Guard Investigative Service, the dive teams, the ROV, the cadaver dog, the forensic examination of a seized vessel, are formidable. And the legal framework under which they operate is clear. When a United States citizen is killed aboard a United States-flagged vessel, it is a federal crime. It falls under federal maritime law. The Coast Guard Investigative Service, CGIS, has full investigative authority. This is not the FBI. Media outlets have repeatedly misidentified the investigating agency in this case, and it bears repeating clearly. This investigation is being conducted by CGIS, the Coast Guard Investigative Service, which has decades of experience investigating crimes that occur on the water, including homicides. They have pursued cases across oceans, into foreign waters, even, historically, as far as Antarctica, following jurisdiction wherever the law allows them to go. The Bahamian government has cooperated. Permission has been granted for the Coast Guard cutter Margaret Norville to operate in Bahamian waters. Maggie, the cadaver dog, and her handler are returning to the Bahamas with the investigative team. Multiple locations will be searched, both on the water and on land. The eastern shore of Marsh Harbor, areas near the Tilloo Cut, locations south of the boatyard, and the dinghy itself, if Bahamian authorities grant access as expected. There is one more thing worth examining before we look at where this case stands today. Brian Hooker was asked, at some point after Lynette's disappearance, a direct question by a reporter. The question was, do you believe that Lynette is still alive? It is the kind of question that, if you have just lost someone you love to the ocean and you are holding on to hope, you answer in one particular way, with grief, with desperation, with the specific agony of not knowing. His answer, recorded on camera, was this. He said he did believe she was alive because he had been told that people had survived in the Bahamas after falling overboard for days, even weeks. That answer is notable not for what it says, but for what it does not say. He did not say, I believe she is alive because I know Lynette. I believe she is alive because she is strong. I believe she is alive because I would know if she was gone. He cited a data point, a statistical argument, a reference to other cases. He argued for her survival the way someone argues a position, not the way someone prays for a miracle. That moment, captured on camera, is the kind of moment that prosecutors study. It is the kind of moment that juries remember. Now let us talk about the new development that changed everything. Several weeks into what had been classified as a missing persons investigation, sources confirmed to reporters covering this case that investigators had formally reclassified the matter. This is no longer a case of a woman who went missing at sea. This is a suspected murder investigation. The decision to reclassify reflects a threshold that investigators reached based on the totality of what they had gathered: the GPS data, the surveillance footage, the witness accounts, the forensic examination of Soulmate, the background information on the relationship between Brian and Lynette Hooker, and the absence of any physical evidence or corroborated testimony that supports Brian Hooker's account of what happened that night. Reclassification as a murder investigation has legal consequences. It changes the resources that can be deployed. It changes the authority under which investigators are operating. It changes what can be subpoenaed, what warrants can be issued, and how the case is built toward eventual prosecution. It also means that if Brian Hooker had not already retained a new attorney with federal litigation experience, he would have needed to do so immediately. The fact that he retained that attorney shortly before or around the time of the reclassification suggests that he or those advising him anticipated that this moment was coming. He may have read the direction of the investigation. He may have understood before the public did that the Coast Guard was not going away. TikTok. Where does the case stand today? The Coast Guard cutter Margaret Norville is en route to or already operating in Bahamian waters. Dive teams are in or preparing to enter the water at multiple locations. The ROV is conducting or preparing to conduct underwater searches in areas identified by GPS analysis and investigative logic. Maggie is working the land and water, her nose processing the chemistry of what the ocean may have tried to hide. Soulmate is being prepared for dry dock examination. The dinghy is pending search. Forensic analysis of the vessel's interior continues. Brian Hooker has not been charged. He has an attorney. He has exercised the rights available to him under the law, as he is entitled to do. He has not, to public knowledge, provided a revised or additional account of the events of April 4th. Lynette Hooker's mother, Darlene Hamlet, is waiting. Lynette's daughter, Carly Ellsworth, is waiting. A family is waiting for answers that only the sea, the forensic record, and the truth of what happened aboard Soulmate that night can provide. The theories in this case are not difficult to enumerate. The first, and the one investigators appear to find most credible based on available evidence, is that Lynette Hooker was killed aboard Soulmate, or the dinghy, on the night of April 4th, and that her body was subsequently disposed of in the waters of the Sea of Abaco by Brian Hooker, who then navigated the dinghy to the eastern shore of Marsh Harbor and constructed the story of a tragic accident to conceal what he had done. The evidence that supports this theory includes the GPS track, the surveillance footage of his behavior at the boatyard, the absence of any witnesses who saw anything consistent with his account, and the documented history of violence against Lynette. The gaps in this theory are what investigators are now working to fill: the specific location of Lynette's remains, the specific cause of death, and the physical evidence that would allow prosecutors to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. The second theory, the one Brian Hooker has implicitly advanced, is that this was a terrible accident, that Lynette fell from the dinghy, that he could not recover her, that he was genuinely stranded, that his behavior at the boatyard, however strange it appeared on camera, reflects the shock and dissociation of a man who had just lived through a nightmare. The evidence that could support this theory is largely absent. There are no witnesses to the accident. There is no physical evidence on the dinghy confirming Lynette was in it when she entered the water. The GPS data does not support passive drifting, and his behavior on camera does not resemble any recognized pattern of acute grief response. The evidence supports parts of neither theory fully, but it leaves critical gaps in one of them that science, forensics, and investigative work may yet close. One additional note on jurisdiction and what it means for prosecution. If Lynette Hooker was killed aboard Soulmate, a United States-flagged vessel, then her murder is a federal crime regardless of where in the world it occurred. The case would be prosecuted in a United States federal court under maritime law. There is no statute of limitations on murder. If Brian Hooker is charged, tried, and convicted, the sentence under federal maritime homicide statutes can include life imprisonment. The Bahamian government has been cooperative throughout this investigation, and there is no indication that extradition or jurisdictional conflicts will present obstacles to prosecution if charges are filed. This is a case that will be resolved by evidence, not by story, by forensics, not by sympathy, by what the GPS recorded, what the camera saw, what the cadaver dog finds, and what the divers and the ROV recover from the floor of the Sea of Abaco. Lynette Hooker bought a ticket home. She was 38 days away from stepping off that boat and walking back into a life she was trying to reclaim. She had told the people who loved her that she was done. She had reached the decision that so many survivors of intimate partner violence reach only after years of waiting, the decision that it was time to go. She never made it. But the investigation is not over. The search is not over. And the law does not forget. If you have any information related to the disappearance and suspected murder of Lynette Hooker, authorities are asking that you contact the Coast Guard Investigative Service. Tips can also be submitted through official law enforcement channels in both the United States and the Bahamas. Before we close, if this case has touched you, if you recognized something in Lynette's story or in the story of someone you know, please reach out to the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233, available 24 hours a day. You can also text START to 88788. Help is there. This is the Crime Files. If you found this investigation valuable, please subscribe. New episodes go up every week, covering cases that demand this kind of careful, evidence-based examination. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. The truth travels farther when more people carry it. And if you are new here, go back and listen from the beginning. The full story of Soulmate, what investigators found, what Lynette's family said, what the GPS data revealed, is documented in detail across the previous episodes of this series. The search for Lynette continues. The search for truth continues, and this case may still have answers waiting to be found. This is not just a story. It is a real life, a real family, a woman who bought a ticket home and never used it. The search for truth continues. Let us take one more careful pass through this case, because the details matter. The details are what separates evidence from speculation. The details are what builds a case that can withstand the scrutiny of a federal courtroom. Think about what it takes to disappear someone from a sailboat. Think about the logistics of it. The Sea of Abaco is not a remote wilderness. It is a busy stretch of water frequented by other boaters, by fishing vessels, by the pleasure craft of tourists and liveaboards who know these waters well. April 4th into April 5th was not a night of total isolation. There were other boats in the area. There were lights visible on the water. A witness named Dean, who lived on a nearby island, had cameras pointed toward the stretch of water where Soulmate was anchored. His footage captured light activity in the darkness near the area where the boat sat. What was that light activity? Movement at night on the water, visible from shore, in the vicinity of a boat whose owner would later claim to have been helplessly adrift. These are the kinds of details that, individually, mean little. Together, they construct a picture. Investigators are not building this case on one piece of evidence. They never do in maritime homicide cases. The ocean takes things. The sea erases. What investigators rely on is the convergence of multiple data points: the GPS, the footage, the witness accounts, the behavior at the boatyard, the forensic examination of the vessel, the history of the relationship, each one pointing in the same direction. When every arrow points the same way, that is not coincidence. That is a pattern. And patterns documented carefully and presented to a jury are what convictions are made of. There is something else worth noting about Brian Hooker's professional history, because it speaks to a particular skill set. Before living aboard Soulmate, Hooker worked for AT&T as a technician. He was a union steward, and according to people who worked alongside him, he was eventually terminated. After multiple attempts by the company to let him go for manipulating the GPS device on his work vehicle, he falsified his location data. He made the company's records show him somewhere he was not. He was fired for it, but not before demonstrating over a period of time that he understood exactly how GPS tracking works, what it records, and how it can be defeated or manipulated. A man who once falsified his own location data is now the subject of an investigation in which GPS data is one of the central pieces of evidence against him. Whether he understood the limitations of what he was able to manipulate on the dinghy, whether he made mistakes that the Coast Guard's forensic analysts have now identified, is something that investigators are actively working to determine. This is the detail that cannot be overlooked. This is not a man unfamiliar with tracking technology. This is a man with a documented professional history of attempting to defeat tracking technology. And yet the GPS data from the dinghy appears to contradict his story. Either he made errors he did not anticipate, or the technology recorded the truth more thoroughly than he expected it to. Either way, it is recorded, and the Coast Guard has it. Let us also address what happens next, procedurally, so that those following this case understand what to watch for. If the dive teams recover physical evidence, a body, weight equipment, personal items belonging to Lynette, that evidence will be cataloged, forensically processed, and potentially used to establish cause and manner of death. If Maggie alerts on a specific location in the water or on land, that location becomes a priority search site. If the ROV identifies an object of interest at depth, divers will investigate. If the forensic examination of Soulmate in dry dock reveals biological material, blood, tissue, hair, in areas that cannot be explained by Brian Hooker's account of events, that evidence goes to a federal laboratory for analysis. The case does not need all of these things. It needs enough to prove beyond a reasonable doubt in a federal court that Lynette Hooker was murdered aboard Soulmate on the night of April 4th, 2025. And that her husband Brian Hooker is responsible for her death. What constitutes enough is the judgment call of federal prosecutors working in close coordination with the Coast Guard Investigative Service. Those prosecutors exist. They are watching this investigation, and when investigators believe the evidence is sufficient, they will present it to a grand jury. If the grand jury agrees that probable cause exists, an indictment will follow, and Brian Hooker will be charged. That moment has not yet come, but everything in this investigation suggests it may be approaching. For Darlene Hamlet, Lynette's mother, every day without answers is another day of incomprehensible loss. For Carly Ellsworth, Lynette's daughter, every development in this investigation is a reminder of what was taken and by whom. These are real people, carrying real grief, waiting for the justice system to do what it is supposed to do. The Crime Files does not promise outcomes. We do not declare guilt before courts do. We examine evidence. We ask questions. We hold to the standard that the truth, however long it takes, is worth pursuing. Lynette Hooker deserves that standard. Her family deserves that standard. And the sea, whatever it is hiding, will eventually give up what it knows. The search continues, the truth continues, and this case is far from over.